So we are going to be learning the fourth parak, Bez Hashem. We're up to the fourth parak, which is the fourth chapter on page 26a. And until now, we were discussing the laws of Shema. This parak switches gear and starts talking about the laws of the actual prayer, the Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings, which now are 19 blessings. It's the blessings of the Amidah, which are established by Ezra. Basically, prayer, tefillah, is a mitzvah. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah in the Torah. The Ramban says that it's rabbinic. But even according to the Rambam, that it's biblical, the biblical obligation doesn't clarify how many times a day a person has to pray, and it doesn't give us any specific details of the content of the prayer. So that is all rabbinic. So until Ezra, who took the Jewish people back to Israel after the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and after the story of Purim, after the story of Purim with Esther and Achashverosh, and the Jewish people were given permission by Darius II to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, and they did. And Ezra led the Jewish people back to Israel. Well, Koresh initially gave them permission, and then took it away, and then Darius II gave them permission to rebuild it. And Ezra took a large group of the Jewish people back to Israel. So Ezra, which is approximately 400, 350 before the Common Era, that's when the Beis Hamikdash was rebuilt. And that's the same Ezra who established many laws. And one of those laws was the Shemona Esrei, how he together with the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly, they established exactly how the Shemona Esrei would be recited. And they also established how many prayers a day a person should recite. And of course, we know that there are 3 prayers every day, Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. And that's what our Mishnah is going to be discussing, the times for the prayers. So the Gemara then will tell us also the reason. What did Ezra and the Anshe Knesset Agdola, who did they rely on to establish these 3 prayers? What was the basis? And so we'll see that in the Gemara. But first, the Gemara tells us more the details of the times. When is a person supposed to recite the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer, the night prayer, the Musaf prayer? What are the times? Where is a person? When is it too late? And is there any makeup for these prayers if a person missed out? So we're going to start now. We're starting the beginning of the chapter, page 26a. First word is tefilas hashachar, the morning prayer. And this is the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says the morning prayer, ad chatzos, you can recite it until midday. That's when that's the time limit to say the morning prayer is up to midday. That's the first opinion of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says ad daled shots. You have until 4 hours of the day. So the first opinion is until midday. The second opinion is until 4 hours. What does it mean, 4 hours of the day? So 4 hours means that if you divide the day into 12 parts, so in other words, let's say sunrise to sunset, if you divide from sunrise to sunset, let's say it comes to let's say the sun rises at 6 a.m. and it sets at 7 p.m. So each hour is not going to be 60 minutes. It's going to be more like 70 minutes because you got an extra hour in that day because the sun rose at 6 a.m. and it set at 7 p.m. So it's going to be more like 65 minutes or 67, 66 minutes. It's going to be a little extra each hour. And you have four of those hours to recite the Shemona Esrei. It means to finish the Shemona Esrei by that time, by the fourth hour. Now the Mishnah continues and it talks about what about Mincha? Tfilas HaMincha Ad ha'erev. You have until evening. Now, until evening is a very vague statement. And Rashi says until it's dark, which implies that the time to recite recite Mincha, well, according to Rashi, is once it gets dark, it's too late. Rabbeinu Yoina says, what does it mean, Erev? So Rabbeinu Yoina here says that he brings a proof to his explanation. He says that it can't mean sunset because the he brings up, excuse me, Rabbeinu Yoina says that it can't mean dusk when stars come out. He says because there's a Talmudic statement where it says that the blood that has to be sprinkled, it can only be sprinkled until sunset. Once sunset happens, you can no longer sprinkle the blood, and the korban, the sacrifice, is no longer acceptable. And therefore, he says, Mincha, the prayer of Mincha would be similar to the sprinkling of the blood for the sacrifice. And if the sacrifice had to be sprinkled, the blood had to be sprinkled before sunset. So he says that must be the meaning of Tfilas HaMincha, that Mincha prayer is until sunset. So Rashi says until dark, but Rabbeinu Yoina says until sunset. And this creates, of course, a big area of discussion of until when can you daven Mincha. And it's if you go to some Hasidic shtibels, you will find that they daven Mincha very late, much later than you would find in regular shuls, Ashkenazic shuls that would never daven Mincha so late. And this is one of the this has to do with this Mishnah where it says Mincha is until Erev. I should also mention that it's based on another big argument, and that is that there is an area, a gray area of when night, what is considered night or what is considered questionably night. The Talmud calls this gray area Bein Hashmashos, in between the evenings. There's a term in the Talmud called Bein Hashmashos, which means that there's an area of time that's gray. We're not sure if it's considered day or night. There seems to be a contradiction, because in one place in the Talmud it says this gray area lasts for 4 mil. A mil is, according to common opinion, is 18 minutes. So 4 mil would be 72 minutes. And it says between the Shkia, sunset, and between and dusk, there are 4 mil. That's what one Talmudic statement says. Another Talmudic statement says that the area in question, Bein Hashmashos, is 3/4 of a mil, 3/4 of 18 minutes, which would be like 13 and a half minutes. So the commentaries deal with how to reconcile this debate. In other words, it seems like there is between Shkia, between sunset and dusk, it's either 72 minutes or it's 13 and a half minutes. What is the amount of time that's gray in that we don't know if it's day or night? Where does that time period fall? Is it 72 minutes, which one Talmudic statement says between sunset and dusk is 72 minutes, it's 4 mil. And another place it says that there's an area of question called Bein Hashmashos, which is somewhere in between. It's gray. We don't know if it's day or night, and that amount of time is 3/4 of a mil, which would mean 13 and a half minutes, 3/4 of 18. And so in order to answer and reconcile this argument, this contradiction, so one opinion is that the rabbi who said 72 minutes, he retracted and changed his opinion to 13 and a half minutes, which means that sunset is, let's say, 8 p.m., just for argument's sake. Sunset these days is somewhere around that area. It's around 8 p.m. So according to that, after sunset happens, then there's a gray area where we're not sure if it's day or night. But 13 and a half minutes later would be definitely night. Of course, this would be in Israel, in certain areas that are that are near the equator, and so on. It would have to, that would depend on the season. But I guess the minimum amount of time would be 13 and a half minutes that would be considered a gray area. And that would be the common view of many shuls. They like to daven mincha right before sunset. Then they wait a little while and they daven Ma'ariv right after. Now, 13 and a half minutes is a very minimal amount of time. And again, that's the minimum that it would be. And many shuls will add on a few minutes to the 13 and a half minutes to be sure that it's definitely night, and you won't have to repeat reciting the Shema, and you will have daven for sure when it's night. So I know in many, like here in Florida, in the shul I go to, they wait 25 minutes. Some shuls wait 30 minutes. But it's based on this opinion that 13 and a half minutes would be the minimum amount of time that's considered the gray area. And we don't follow the 72-minute opinion that is mentioned in the Talmud, but the understanding is that rabbi retracted and changed his opinion to the 3/4 of a mil, which is 13 and a half minutes, which you add on to that, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and so on. So that's basically the view. It's called the view of the Go'anim. The rabbis after the Talmud, they would call the Go'anim, and that's how they understood it. They follow that view that we wait a minimal amount of time after sunset, and that's when we can calculate that it's definitely night. There is another view, and that's the famous view called Rabbeinu Tam's view, and that is that you wait 72 minutes in order for it to be really definitely dark. In that view, how does it reconcile this contradiction? Because that view holds that there's 2 sunsets. There's the beginning of sunset and there's the end of sunset. So the beginning of sunset is what we call sunset. And that sunset ends 13 and a half minutes before 72 minutes. So it's 58 and a half minutes is when the end of that sunset happens. Then comes the gray area, and then you have the definite night. And so that's how that view understands and answers this contradiction. And according to them, the night, questionable night, doesn't really begin until 58.5 minutes after sunset. And that's why if you go to some shtibels, you'll see they're still davening mincha very late. And what I'm explaining to you is because they're following that view that there's the beginning sunset and there's the end of sunset. And the end of sunset is when it's too late to daven mincha. And that would be, one way of understanding this Mishnah. Until Erev, until night, would be until the end of the Shkia, until the end time. In other words, the beginning time of sunset is not night yet. It's the end time of sunset that would be considered night, according to them, 58.5 minutes after sunset. Now, of course, that's not the common view among Ashkenazic Jews, but it is. There are many Hasidic shtibels that follow that leniency. Not for Shabbos. You can't rely on that for Shabbos. No one's going to do work after sunset. For Shabbos, you have to be strict. But when it comes to davening mincha, there are definitely there are those that are lenient. Yes, Susan.
Rabbi, the three prayers or the three davenings, they're all the same, are they not?
You're correct. The Shemona Esrei itself is the same in the three prayers, and nevertheless, we do pray 3 times a day, even though you're saying the same thing, and we continue the next day as well with the same prayers.
Right.
But you're right. Yes, Ben.
Yeah, I wanted to say, but what is with the 3 stars at night that tells us that the day is changing?
So the 3 stars is definitely connected to when it's definitely night. It's the later. It's when you can daven Ma'ariv and Shabbos when Shabbos is over and so on. That 3 stars is the latest time.
Okay.
That would be the dusk that I'm referring to. Dusk. It's called Seis HaKrechavim. But those 3 stars would not be connected to Mincha. They would be connected to Ma'ariv or Shema at night and so on. So the Mishnah said that when do you daven Mincha until? So the Mishnah said you could daven Mincha until Erev. And we said that there's different ways of translating Erev. And Rashi here says dark, and Rabbeinu Yonah says it means sunset. And the next opinion in the Mishnah is a little complicated. Rabbi Yehuda says that really, Rabbi Yehuda Aimer ad plag ha-mincha, you have until half of mincha to daven mincha. Now, what is mincha? What does he mean? You have until half of mincha. So there are 2 times that are called mincha. Mincha, there's something called mincha gedola, the large mincha, which means from 12:30 until sunset. That would be mincha. And then there's another time called mincha called the smaller mincha, which is a shorter period of time. It's from 3:30 in the afternoon until sunset. 3:30, I don't mean exactly 3:30. I mean, based on the day, it would be either 9.5 hours after sunrise would be what I'm calling 3:30. Let's say sunrise is 6 a.m. So a simple day would be 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So if you would calculate 9.5 hours after sunrise, it would be 3:30. 6 a.m. plus 9.5 hours would be 3:30. So from 3:30 till sunset would be mincha ketana, the small mincha. Mincha gedola would be from 12:30 until sunset. I'll give you an example. When you want to daven mincha early, there are many shuls, many yeshivas, they'll daven mincha before lunch. They don't want to eat and wash before they daven mincha. So they daven mincha and then they go to, then they have lunch in some yeshivas. What time, when are they davening mincha? They're davening mincha at mincha gedolah, at the large mincha. They're davening right after the earliest time you could daven mincha is a half hour after noon. Noon is based on exactly the midpoint between sunrise and sunset. And so you wait a half hour after that time, that would be 6.5 hours into the day. That's called the mincha gedolah, the large time of mincha. And then the other time of mincha is called mincha ketana. And mincha ketana, I believe could have legal laws. There are laws about mincha ketana, maybe regarding stopping to do work on Friday and so on. But mincha ketana would be 9.5 hours after the sunrise, and on a simple day, 6 to 6 would be 3:30. So Rabbi Yehuda here says, if you divide mincha in half, that's when you can daven mincha until half. Now, what would that mean? So he either means half of the big mincha. So again, it's 6.5 hours into the day. Starts mincha gedolah. That means how much time is left for mincha gedolah? 5.5 hours of the day. You have 5.5 hours of the day. If you divide that in half, how much is 5.5 divided in 2?
2 and 3.
2 3/4, right? So 2 3/4 hours from before sunset would be the end time of mincha, according to, if that's the meaning of Rabbi Yehuda. Another translation of Rabbi Yehuda would mean half of mincha ketana, half of the small mincha. What is the small mincha? 9.5 hours in the day. That's beginning of the small mincha. How much time is left for the small mincha? 2.5 hours of the day. If you divide that in half, because Rabbi Yehuda says you have until half of mincha. So let's say he means the small mincha. That means 2.5 divided in half would be 1 1/4. And so what we would do would be subtract 1 1/4 hours from sunset, and that would be the final time to daven mincha. I'll give you a practical example. Today, Ma'ariv, today, if you calculate the times for when is sunset and when is the plag ha-mincha, half of mincha. So here in Florida, sunset is 8:01. Now, if you take 1 1/4 before 8:01, it would be approximately 6:45. That would be half of mincha. 1 1/4 before 8:01 would be approximately 6:45. Now, what is Rabbi Yehuda saying? Rabbi Yehuda holds that you would have to daven. The exact time is actually 6:42. Again, it depends on when sunrise is and when sunset is, and you have to calculate the hours. 1 1/4 doesn't mean 60 minutes plus 15 minutes. It doesn't mean 75 minutes. It actually means dividing the day into 12 parts, and each hour would actually be 66 minutes and 26 seconds today. That's exactly how long an hour is today. So if you have 1 1/4, but the hour is 66 minutes and 26 seconds, and a quarter would not be 15 minutes, it would be more like 16 or 17 minutes. So you would add 16 or 17 onto 66, and then you would subtract that from 8:01. It would be 6:42 p.m. would be plag ha-mincha. So half of mincha, and what is Rabbi Yehuda saying? That you really are not allowed to daven mincha after that time, after 6:42. Now, we all daven mincha until 8 o'clock p.m., right? We don't follow Rabbi Yehuda, but there is a concept of making early Shabbos. Have any of you heard of early Shabbos? that you can accept Shabbos early, that opinion is relying on Rabbi Yehuda. That means that you're relying on Rabbi Yehuda's view. If you want to make early Shabbos, which is acceptable in halacha, there is a concept of making early Shabbos. Many shuls do that. They're relying on Rabbi Yehuda. What are they saying? That really you can daven Ma'ariv right after 6:42 p.m. and you daven Mincha before 6:42 p.m. You daven Ma'ariv right after 6:42 p.m. and you're all set. You can actually start your Shabbos meal early, and not like us, who we finish our Shabbos meal at midnight because the Shabbos is so late. You could actually have a normal schedule if you do early Shabbos. So this Mishnah is the source of early Shabbos, and this is the opinion, Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Again, the common opinion is that you daven Mincha until night, and Ma'ariv would start after that, after it's night. The opinion of Rabbi Yehuda is that you daven Mincha until half of Mincha. You divide Mincha, which we're going to translate to mean Mincha Ketana, the small Mincha, which means 9.5 hours into the day, which means you only have 2.5 hours left of the day. You divide that in half. The first half is time for Mincha. After that is time for Ma'ariv. You would be allowed to daven Ma'ariv after half of that Mincha. So there's the earlier half and the later half. The earlier half is Mincha. That's the time limit, your time frame for Mincha. You have to finish Mincha by half of that Mincha time, half of that 2.5 hours, the 1.25 hours you have until to daven Mincha. And after that, you have 1.25 hours early to start Ma'ariv. You could start Ma'ariv earlier than anyone else is starting Ma'ariv, 1.25 hours. And that is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that holds that would be the time for Mincha and for Ma'ariv. So again, he's not only telling you what time Mincha is, but he's actually adding to you something else that you could daven Ma'ariv early. You could do the night service 1.25 hours before sunset, which is very early. And this really is a topic of much discussion with regard to the fact that what happens if you missed Mincha, you daven Mincha late, can you still make early Shabbos? In other words, according to Rabbi Yehuda, your Mincha is supposed to be before half of Mincha, before that 1.25 hours is over. And you daven Mincha then, and then you can daven Ma'ariv 1.25 hours before sunset. What happens if you didn't daven Mincha in its time, according to Rabbi Yehuda? Can you follow the Rabbanan, the rabbi's view for Mincha, and then jump to Rabbi Yehuda for Ma'ariv? Or would that be a contradiction? Another issue is you have many shuls that they can't get a minyan. It's very hard for them to get a minyan. Would they be allowed to daven Mincha and Ma'ariv right away? Because maybe you could rely on Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you could daven Ma'ariv early before sunset. You could daven Ma'ariv 1.25 hours before sunset. And according to that, there might be room for leniency in a shul where you can't get a minyan. Otherwise, it'll be impossible to get a minyan. Maybe you could daven Ma'ariv early, and this way you'll be able to have a minyan. And so you daven Mincha and Ma'ariv. Many shuls do this. It's definitely not preferable, but there is room for leniency if you're not going to be able to get a minyan otherwise, that the shul would daven Mincha and Ma'ariv basically one after another, but it's before night. They're davening Ma'ariv before night. So in the halachic terminology, it would be called tarti desasri, a contradiction. You're contradicting yourself. Is it day now or is it night now? Who are you following? Are you following Rabbi Yehuda or are you following the rabbis? Because according to one opinion, it's day and you can daven Mincha, but you can't daven Ma'ariv. According to the other opinion, it's really night and you can't daven Mincha, but you can daven Ma'ariv. And you're doing both. You're contradicting yourself. You're doing a tarti desastre. Now, there is room for leniency in a shul, but what about a person who wants to daven early Shabbos? There's a lot of discussion. If all week long you daven one way And then Friday, all of a sudden, you want to say, no, I follow Rabbi Yehuda. I can daven Ma'ariv early because I'm following Rabbi. You follow Rabbi Yehuda a whole week. You followed the rabbis. All of a sudden, you want to follow Rabbi Yehuda because it's Friday. You want to take it easy. Is that a contradiction? And there are opinions that say that you can't do it if you don't do it always. There are such views that you can't just one day decide to daven Ma'ariv early. Maybe Shabbos, you could be lenient. There's some opinions that say Shabbos is different. Maybe Shabbos you could daven. But what happens one day you say, you know what? I want to daven early. I'll give you an example. There's a Century Village in Pembroke Pines that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at least at one point, they were davening mincha before Plag every day. They have a group of senior citizens that aren't going to stay up late. They go to sleep early. And so they would daven mincha every day, a whole year round. Before Plag on mincha, like 6:42, they would daven mincha, let's say 6:30, finish it by 6:42. And then they would daven Ma'ariv after 6:42. And that's how they set their schedule all year round. Now that, if you do it all year round, then that's no problem. They're following Rabbi Yehuda. What I'm talking about is what happens if you one day you say, you know what, I want to go to sleep early. Let me daven mincha according to Rabbi Yehuda and Ma'ariv according to Rabbi Yehuda. I'll do an early opinion today. Is that considered a contradiction because all year round you don't do it that way? So this is the Mishnah, that the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the source of early Shabbos. And now the Mishnah tells us Tfilas ha'erev ein la keva. The night prayer doesn't have a limit. It's all night. It's not till 4 hours. It's not till 6 hours. Not till midnight. It's all night. You can daven Ma'ariv. Ein la keva. V'shel musafin kol hayoim, and musaf you could daven all day as well. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad zayin shois. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to daven Ma'ariv musaf until 7 hours. So this is the end of the Mishnah. Susan, you have a question?
Yes. During the pandemic, were the shuls allowing people online to be a minyan, or to be a minyan you had to be physically in the temple?
Good question. Yeah. A minyan is a quorum of 10 in a physical place together. And so the only thing that you could do with like a Zoom type of a minyan is that if there's a minyan going on in a physical place, a person who's listening could answer to the kedusha and do the responses, but okay, he's not considered davening with a minyan. The minyan itself needs to be a physical group. A
physical place. Okay.
Yeah, the physical group. Now there is a concept of davening at the same time that a minyan is davening. So if there is a minyan in a physical place, all right, davening together, and you want to daven at the same time, it's called Bisha'a Shehat Tzibor Mispalulim. The time that the minyan is davening, it's a little auspicious to daven. It's a little extra credit to daven at that time. But the real minyan is you have to be in that place. And it definitely has to, to be considered a minyan, it has to be all in one place.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so now that we've learned the Mishnah, let's just go over it. So we have the morning davening. There's an argument. The first opinion is until midday. And again, that midday doesn't mean 12 o'clock noon. It means the midday between sunrise and sunset. Now, I keep saying sunrise and sunset, but I should say there is another view. And that other view says everything goes by dawn and dusk. And it doesn't change much regarding the midday, but it will change with regard to the 4th hour of the day. Because if you start from dawn instead of from sunrise, the 4th hour of the day is going to be about 36 minutes different, or I should say 48 minutes different than, because about 12, because you're adding, you're starting earlier. You're starting earlier, so you're going to have an earlier deadline. So there is such a view. It's known as the Magen Avraham's time. And there are many people that try to say Shema and follow the Magen Avraham's opinion, and meaning they start the day, they start counting the hours from dawn. The common view, the common accepted view is you start from sunrise and everything ends at sunset. But there is such a stringency that some people have, which is very nice to be extra stringent to fulfill the opinion of the Magen Avraham and start from sunrise, start from dawn, and you start calculating your hours from then. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say, if Shabbat is different and we can change times a little, why can't we change Kabbalat Shabbat? Why are people against making Kabbalat Shabbat יותר מוקדם, earlier?
Kabbalat Shabbat is no problem. The earliest you can accept Shabbos is Plag HaMincha. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda.
That's what I mean, yeah.
This is the earliest you can accept Shabbos. What that means is that any shul can start Kabbalah Shabbos early, an hour and a quarter. You can light candles early. A woman can light candles an hour and a quarter early as well. That is acceptable. So if a shul wants to do Kabbalah Shabbos and start early, they can. But the problem they're going to have is that they're going to lose a lot of their participants because, if you drag out a Kabbalah Shabbos for an hour and a quarter, and that's only until sunset, then you got to wait another 25 minutes until Ma'ariv. So you're talking about keeping people there an hour and 45 minutes. So you're not gaining that much. In other words, we're dealing with the issue is that, you're davening Ma'ariv late. I mean, when Shabbos comes in late, even without the Kabbalah Shabbos issue, it's quite late. But you're right. You can start Kabbalah Shabbos. Your question is a good question. And the answer is you're right. You can start Kabbalah Shabbos early, as long as it's within an hour and a quarter of night. You could start it early. Yes, Susan, you have another question?
Yes, I thought exactly at sunset, when I stand outside and watch, make sure, run in and light the candles at sunset. Exactly. Isn't that, you're telling me that I can, the sun can still be just moving and I can light the candles?
Yes, an hour and a quarter. The time, like, for example, today, if today was Friday, sunset, let's say today was Friday, sunset would be 8:01, and you could light candles from 6:42.
Oh my gosh, I did not.
6:42. Now, I should mention that 8:01 is sunset. You're not allowed to light at 8:01. You would have to light a few minutes before. Generally, in the calendars, they give you 18 minutes before. That's when you should light, really, 18 minutes before.
Right.
If you want to light before that, even better. That's even better. But not before 6:42.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Wow.
Now, if you look up on the computer, you can always look, it's called halachic times. Halachic times are calendars that they have. People, there are some good websites like Chabad.org, and there are other websites that have halachic time calendars, and they will tell you exactly when the earliest time to light is. And it's called Plag HaMincha. It's the term that our Mishnah uses, Plag HaMincha, half of Mincha. That would be the earliest time to light Shabbos candles as well. So you can often look it up and see when if you want to light extra early, let's say you want to go take a nap or something, you could look it up on the computer, the halachic time. Make sure you have the right date, because it fluctuates every day. It changes a minute or two. Okay.
Well, thank you. Wow.
So again, we're going over the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that the morning prayer, there are two opinions, either till midday or until the 4th hour of the day. Mincha, you have until Erev, which we said is the difference of opinion, what this means. And actually, I should mention, I did mention to you the source of Rabbeinu Yoina, who says it means until sunset. That's when you have to daven mincha. because you're not allowed to sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice after sunset. So he says that's what it must mean here. It means until sunset. That's the final time to sprinkle the blood. The question is, how does Rashi learn? Rashi says you have late until dark. You could daven mincha until dark. How would Rashi learn that Gemara? The Gemara says you can only do the sacrifice, sprinkle the blood until sunset. So the commentaries explain that when it says until sunset in the Talmud that you could sprinkle the blood, it means until the end of sunset, which is that opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, which is 58 and a half minutes after sunset. So when Rashi says until dark, he's relying on that understanding of sunset in translating the Gemara that says that you could sprinkle the blood of a sacrifice until sunset to mean the end sunset, the end of sunset. Again, there's an opinion that says there's the beginning of sunset and there's the end of sunset, the beginning of Shkia and the end of Shkia, and there's a difference of 58 and a half minutes. And so Rashi would follow that view that explain that you could sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice until the end of sunset. It's called the second Shkia, or the end of Shkia, and that would be that view of Rabbeinu Tam, which and that's how he would translate the meaning of you could daven mincha until then, just like you could sprinkle the blood until then. Now, the Mishnah continued, and it said that there is another opinion that mincha you don't have until night, until dark, or until sunset. The opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that says you daven mincha until half of mincha. I mentioned to you there's two things that could mean mincha. It could mean 6.5 hours in the day, which would mean half of 5.5. The latter 5.5 hours would be the time for mincha, and then afterwards you would daven ma'ariv. Or it could mean 9.5 hours into the day, which means you have 2.5 hours left. You would divide that in half. So 1.25 hours would be for mincha, and then the other half would be for ma'ariv. But Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you can daven ma'ariv at half of mincha. In other words, you can only daven mincha halfway through mincha, and then it's time for ma'ariv. That's Rabbi Yehuda's view. That's the source of early Shabbos. And then we mentioned that ma'ariv has no set time, and you have all night for it. And then we spoke about Musaf. You either have all day to daven Musaf. Musaf is that extra prayer that's recited on holidays like today, Rosh Chodesh, or on Shabbos, or on other holidays. And Rabbi Yehuda says you have until 7 hours. Now the Gemara starts off and it says V'raminu. V'raminu is the yeshiva asked a contradiction. The students of the yeshiva, they asked a contradiction for V'raminu, and we ask a contradiction. Mitzvasa im hanetzachama. The mitzvah is to say the Shema with the netzachama, with sunrise, kedei sheyismach geula letfila, in order to put the redemption prayer, which is the blessing, right before the Shemona Esrei. It's called the redemption prayer. That should be right next to the actual prayer, Shemona Esrei, the Amidah. So the Shema should be while the sun is just about to rise, so that you could say the Shemona Esrei right by sunrise. And right next to the redemption prayer, you have right next to redemption, you have the Shemona Esrei. V'nimtza b'spalo bayoim, and it comes out that you are davening bayoim right when it turns day, right when it becomes day. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds like the proper time to daven the morning prayer is right when it becomes sunrise. Our Mishnah said you have until noon, or you have until 4 hours in the day to do the morning prayer. And this statement that we just read in the Gemara says you're supposed to daven right at the morning, right when it turns sunrise. That's when you're supposed to daven, and you're supposed to say the Shema right then, and then you have the redemption prayer. It's a blessing, Goal Yisrael, and right after that you do the Shemona Esrei. So it's right by the sunrise. That's when you're supposed to do the Shemona Esrei, right when it turns day, and that seems to contradict our Mishnah that says you have until noon or you have until 4 hours. The two opinions of our Mishnah. So the Gemara answers, and it says, Kitanya hahi levasikim. When did we learn that law that you're supposed to daven by sunrise? That is for the vasikin. And the vasikin, meaning the pious people that do the mitzvahs the earliest time possible, and they bend over backwards, they wake up early to be able to beautify the mitzvah and the most auspicious time, and they daven at sunrise in order to be fulfilling the mitzvah the earliest possible time, and that's when they do their prayer. Now, our Mishnah does not talk about those type of people. That's that statement that the Gemara brought. But our Mishnah talks about the regular person, regular individual. You have, according to the first opinion, you have until noon, not noon, I shouldn't say, but half between sunrise and sunset, which nowadays would be somewhere around 1:26 is what we would call the Jewish noon for today, because that's exactly in between sunrise and sunset. Would be 1:26 would be the final time to say the morning prayer. Or Rabbi Yehuda says until 4 hours of the day, and 4 hours of the day would be 11:13. So 11:13 would be 4 hours into the day. Again, the day started at 6:51. 6:51. Each hour is 66 minutes. So if you calculate 4 hours of 66 minutes each, and the day started at 6:51, you would come to 4 hours would be 11:13. So 11:13 is the final time according to Rabbi Yehuda. According to the rabbis, it's according to the first opinion, it's till midday, and the Vasikin would do it at 6:51. That's when they would pray the morning prayer, the Shemona Esrei part. They would start their prayer probably a half hour before that, but they would reach the Shemona Esrei at 6:51 so that they could daven the Shemona Esrei right when it turned day. So then the Gemara says, the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan says, Vasikin hayu goimren oisa im hanetzacham. The Vasikin, these pious individuals, they would finish the Shema with the Neitz Hachama. Now the Gemara asks, V'kulei alma ad chatzois v'suloi, and everyone, the rest of the world can only daven Shacharis, the morning prayer, until noon, and not more. V'suloi. V'ha'amar Reb Meri b'rei de Rav Huna, b'rei de Reb Yirmiyah bar Rabba, and Rabbi Yochanan. But we have all these rabbis that say it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Reb Meri, the son of Rav Huna, the son of Reb Yirmiyah, the bar Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. He says that if a person made a mistake, if he messed up and he didn't daven Ma'ariv, what do? You fell asleep. You forgot to daven Ma'ariv. So you can daven Shachris twice. What happens if you forgot to daven the morning prayer? Shachris. Mispalo b'mincha time, you could daven mincha twice. You could daven the afternoon prayer twice. Kule yoima.
Rabbi,
Yes.
Mariv is very different than Shachrit. There are different prayers other than the Amida? Are you meaning just the Amida you do twice?
Yeah, the Amida. We're just talking
Oh.
about the Amida.
Okay.
So the Gemara is asking that when is the deadline to daven Shachris? Our Mishnah seemed to say the deadline was either 4 hours in the day, Rabbi Yehuda, or the first opinion, midday. That was the Mishnah. Here we have a statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if a person misses the morning prayer, what does he do? He can daven mincha twice. You could do 2 minchas. So it sounds like the deadline is much later. You could daven 2 minchas. It's 7. Where are they davening mincha? 7:45 p.m. 7:45 p.m. You go to shul, you daven mincha, and then you daven a second one as a makeup for Shachris, for the morning prayer. So is the deadline midday, or is the deadline mincha? That mincha, you could daven 2 minchas.
Rabbi, one more question.
Yeah.
Mincha, there is a Chazara and the Amida. Shachrit, there is not. So how do you do that when you say twice? Once with the Chazara and once without?
No. You're not the Chazan. But you just do a second, you do a second Shemona Esrei, and
without the repetition.
No, there's no repetition to your. Don't tell anyone that you messed up. You're not going to tell everyone.
No, I wouldn't.
you keep it quiet. You do your second Shemona Esrei. Stand on the side of this corner. No one sees you, and you do your second Shemona Esrei over there. No one has to know anything. So, the Gemara seems to find this as a contradiction, and the Gemara answers that it's really a makeup if you miss your morning prayer. You don't get the merit of davening in the right time. You're only getting the merit of davening. You did a makeup, but it's not a full makeup, and therefore. The real time to daven is until noon or until 4 hours in the day, according to each view, respectively. But if you want to make it up later, fine, you can do a makeup, but it's not really giving you the merit of davening in its time. So the Gemara says, Kula yoima matzli v'yazel. A whole day you could daven, but the whole day you could daven. However, that ad chatzos you have a leischar tefillah bismana. Until chatzos we give him the merit of davening in its time. Mikan va'elach, from there and onward, schar tefillah yahavile, the merit of davening we give him. Schar tefillah bismana lo yahavile, but the merit of davening in its time he is not given. He doesn't get that merit, that special reward for davening. So he is in the right time. So that's the Gemara's conclusion about the actual deadline for davening. You either have if you in order to get the merit of davening in its time, you have to fit within that time frame of either 4 hours or midday. Otherwise, afterwards there is a makeup, but it's not a full. You don't get the full merit. Yes, Susan.
Okay, if I'm making the prayers and I'm doing them at the right time, can I be washing dishes at the same time
as doing as praying?
Yes.
There's a story with Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev that he saw someone saying the Shema while he was oiling the wheels of his wagon.
All right.
And Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, he looked up to heaven. He says, Hashem, look at how righteous your people are. Even when they're oiling the wheels of their wagon, they also want to pray and they want to accept the yoke of heaven. They never want to separate for one moment of accepting the yoke of heaven. So even when they're busy oiling the wheels, they make sure to say the Shema. That was his line.
All right, so
What
are
does
you
that
saying
mean?
it's acceptable? It's okay?
So the meaning of the story is that it's shocking that someone would do that. And Reb Levi Yitzchak was looking for something positive to say. So instead of saying, while he's saying Shema, he's oiling the wheels, he said it the opposite. While he's oiling the wheels, he said Shema.
Okay.
And what that means is that it would there's how disrespectful is it when you're supposed to be praying to Hashem, but you're busy doing something else?
And concentrating on praying and not doing other things.
Of course. So now, of course, women have different laws regarding prayer than men. So there are leniencies for women. We've talked about it, the leniencies for women in prayer. But for a man to do such a thing would be totally unheard of, and just total disrespect and so on. And it probably would be better, even if for a woman, if she doesn't have time, better she shouldn't pray than pray while she's doing the dishes. I don't know. To me, it seems total disrespectful.
Yeah.
Okay. The Gemara continues, and the Gemara asks a question. Now, we know that the Jewish day begins at night. Every night starts in Jewish law, that's when the new day begins. Like Shabbos starts when it gets dark. That's when the new day, the day of Shabbos, begins. The day doesn't begin at midnight. The day begins when it gets dark. That's the new day. So the question is, if a person missed mincha, they missed the afternoon service, would they be allowed to make it up by doing 2 Ma'ariv? Would they be allowed to make it up if they daven Ma'ariv twice? On the one hand, it sounds like they could, just like the other prayers. You do the next prayer, you do it twice, you made up for the previous prayer. On the other hand, it's a different day. Here, you're making up on a Tuesday for a Monday prayer. It's a different day. So the Gemara is wondering, does it work? In the source of this question is also based on the fact that the previous statement that we said about making a mistake, what were the examples? One example was you missed Ma'ariv, the night service, so you make it up in the morning. You missed the morning service, you make it up in the afternoon. And that statement did not tell us what happens if you miss the afternoon prayer. Can you make it up at night? It didn't say it. So now the Gemara asks, they asked the question, a person made a mistake. He did not pray the mincha service, the afternoon service. Mahu, what is the law? Sheyaspalal arvis beis, can he daven Ma'ariv twice? Im timtza loymar, if you will say ta'av lehispalal arvis, when you make a mistake and you forget the night service, mispalo shachris space, you daven 2 mornings services. That makes sense. Mishum dechad yoimahu, because that's one day. It's one day. It was evening and it was morning is one day. Day begins at the evening and then morning. That's a day, and that makes sense. If you missed the night prayer, you can make it up in the morning because that's considered the same day. However, but here, prayer is in place of a sacrifice. And there's a concept that by a sacrifice, once the day passes, the sacrifice is over, it's too late. And therefore, there's reason to say that you can't make it up. Oy Dilma, or maybe Kivan Ditzloisa Rachamehi, since prayer is asking God for mercy. Kol Emas de Boy, whenever a person wants, Matzli V'Yozil, he should be able to recite a prayer and go forward. So the Gemara has this dilemma. If a person can make up the afternoon prayer, can he make it up? And is that considered an option or not? It's either acceptable because it's considered like a prayer. Why not? You make up a prayer whenever you want to pray. Or it's similar to sacrifices. Sacrifices, the day is over. The sacrifices, it's too late. And so therefore, there are two ways of looking at it. And the Gemara concludes, and it says, Tashma coming here. The Amar Rav Huna bar Yehuda, Rav Yitzchak, Rav Yechanan. This Rav Huna said in the name of Rav Yitzchak, name of Rav Yechanan, that Tov le'espal mincha, espal iris base. You can make it up. If you miss mincha, you can daven 2 myrivs. Ve'ein bazeh mishum da'avar yomeh batel karbani. It's not a problem of missing the day passed. The karban is no longer acceptable. It's not a problem. If you miss mincha, you can make it up. Even though it's the next day, you can make it up for Ma'ariv. You can daven 2 night prayers. Okay, we're going to stop here. If anyone has questions. Yes, Ezra.
I'm just wondering why the question is even asked, because we know that Shachrit and Mincha are supposed to be Kidneged, the Korban Tamid of the morning and then the afternoon. Ma'ariv, as we're told, is something that was done and then accepted upon the people as kavua, and has nothing at all to do with any kind of korban. Therefore, I would have said that because it has no connection to the korban at all, you can say the following morning as a second shachrit because of that particular fact.
So your question, Ezra, is a great question, and it really connects to the previous statement. The Gemara previously said that if a person misses Ma'ariv, he can make it up with Shachris. That's the previous Gemara. Our Gemara was asking if a person missed Mincha, can he make it up for Ma'ariv? If you ask your question on the previous Gemara, it's a very powerful question. What Ezra is asking is that, what does the Gemara mean? If you missed Ma'ariv, you can make it up. You make it up in the morning. Ma'ariv is not an obligation. What's the big deal? You missed Ma'ariv. You make it up. It sounds like you have to do a makeup. What type of makeup? Ma'ariv, the common understanding is it's a reshus. It's permissive. You're allowed to daven it. You don't have to, and therefore, this is the opinion of Rav. We follow his opinion that it's reshus. And therefore, why would the Gemara talk about missing it and having to make it up? It's really a reshus. And this is Taisvis's question over here in the third Taisvis. He asked that. He also asked a question about Rosh Chodesh. He says, why do we talk about if you miss Yala v'Yava, you miss the addition for Rosh Chodesh at night? And we mentioned that you don't have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. What do you mean repeat the Shemona Esrei? You missed Yala v'Yava at night. You don't have to daven at night for Shemona at all. So why would you have to repeat Shemona Esrei? You miss it at night. You'd have to repeat there's a thought that you would repeat Shemona Esrei. Now, the Gemara concludes you don't have to, but the Gemara concludes you don't have to repeat it at night because of a side reason. The Taisus asks, you need another reason? You don't have to say it in the first place. So of course you don't have to repeat it if you miss the Yala v'Yava. So these are Taisvis's 2 questions. And Taisvis answers something that he answered in other places. I think we've touched on this before. That Taisvis says it's not totally, you're not totally exempt from Ma'ariv. It's only if you have another mitzvah that's passing That's what it means. You're exempt. That you can do that other mitzvah first and push off Ma'ariv, but you're still obligated to daven Ma'ariv, and you can't push off a Ma'ariv just because it's not an obligation. It is an obligation, and you are obligated to daven Ma'ariv. It's just if there's another. This is Tosfos's opinion that there is that you definitely are obligated to daven Ma'ariv. It's only if there's another mitzvah that's pressing that you would push off Ma'ariv and do the other mitzvah. Okay, so but that I think touches on your question. I think that answers your question, Ezra. Ben.
I wanted to say, if we missed Mincha, can we say another Amida any time at night, during the night when we're saying Ma'ariv?
So the proper way to do it, the Gemara's conclusion is you can daven two Ma'arivs, meaning you daven the Shemona Esrei, a second Shemona Esrei. You daven the first Shemona Esrei.
Yeah, but even if it's 2-3 in the morning, then.
Whenever you daven your Shemona Esrei, the concept of Tashlumin is you're supposed to do it while you're davening anyway. Okay. So if you're davening your night prayer, whenever you're davening it, as our Mishnah said, you could daven it at 2 o'clock in the morning. So whenever you're doing your regular prayer of Ma'ariv, you would add another Shemona Esrei afterwards, and you would recite the makeup Shemona